Hello and welcome to Three Opinions, an ongoing conversation about Jewish life, culture, identity, and spirituality based on the age-old adage that when two Jews get together, you're going to get three opinions. I'm Rabbi Yoni Dahlen from Congregation Shaare Zedek in the suburbs of Detroit, and joining me tonight on the Zoom is editor of the Forward's opinion section, freelance writer and contributor to other publications, including The Daily Beast and Tablet, and ethical voice of the Twitterverse, Batya Ungar-Sargon. Batya, thank you for taking the time to do this. I know that you're incredibly busy and things are such a whirlwind right now, so I really appreciate the opportunity for us to talk.
I'm really, truly humbled to be here with you. Thank you so much for asking me.
So I don't want to put too much pressure on you, but this conversation should, in theory, be the paragon of what this initiative is all about, considering, listen, if an opinionated rabbi and an opinions editor for the gold standard of Jewish newspapers coming together doesn't engender the idea of this third opinion, then I don't know what does. So it's a lot of pressure, but I think we can live up to it. So before we dive in to some of, and I want to cover a lot of things that there's impossible to do everything that I want to do in 45 minutes or an hour. But before we dive in, I just have what's probably going to be the most perplexing question I'm going to ask you this entire time, which is why? Why in the world take the job that you decided to take? I mean that in a playful way, but also with some seriousness as part of it, because before you were at the Forward, you were at this great website called VinePair, right? Which is, to those who aren't familiar, is a great website with great blogs about wine, beer, liquor, coffee, cheese, culture. Like that sounds fun and so nice and so good and so refreshing. And though I don't know exactly what that job would entail, but I would assume probably some good wine and some good cheese and some good food and conversation. I can only imagine that involves a lot less people constantly being upset with you and calling you some really horrible names, which I see all the time on your Twitter feed and everything else. So can you talk a little bit about what brought you from there to the Forward?
I mean, now that you put it that way, I realize I've made a huge mistake.
Sorry for framing that. I have to apologize to the Forward now.
I loved working at VinePair. I loved drinking great wine and everything that went along with it. I'll tell you my initial thought when I saw the job posting at the Forward. I thought to myself, I can do that job really well because I can't be bullied on subjects like Israel and Judaism, because my knowledge and familiarity and passion and care and love for the subjects and debates about the subjects were too deep for me to be bullied on the subject. And I thought that that would make me really good at this job, because it would mean that I would have the confidence to admit when I was wrong. And that's really important. And, you know, there are topics where I don't have that confidence, where I wish I had that confidence. And that humility. I really do approach this job with a lot of humility. And humility comes from, you need a certain familiarity with a subject. I grew up Orthodox, very Orthodox, and I grew up in Israel. And so I felt that that would give me, I don't know everything on either of the subjects of Judaism or Israel, but it would give me the confidence to push back against people who try to silence me or silence my writers through bullying. And that familiarity with the text and the familiarity with the region. And I thought that I owed it to the Jewish people to leverage that comfort with these subjects and willingness to engage. And to put myself in that position. It sounds really arrogant, but I actually really mean it with a lot of humility. Because as you mentioned, in a way, as the opinion editor, you become kind of the sacrifice to the passions on both sides, and that's not easy. And it is like a labor of love that is very, very, very thankless. So it's, as you were saying it, I was like, wow, that was such a mistake. But obviously, I don't really think that. I think what we're doing is really important, and almost nobody's doing it anymore. I'll just end with this. I mean, at this point, I think I'm the only liberal, non-Trump aligned publication that will still run Trump supporters or even Republicans. You know, the New York Times really just folded on that front. And as such, I do think of this as God's work. So I guess that's why.
Wow. I mean, so we're gonna go into some of those questions of the courage that's part of this, and also just the sacrificial. I think that's such a perfect image for this. It's very like, sorry, I'm a rabbi, so I'm getting ready for high holidays. So Akedat Yitzchak is very much on my mind, but it feels kind of like that being bound on the altar in that sacrificial way, where and I hope that we can talk about some of these things too, in what's going on in journalism, especially because you're right. It's such a unique time right now, and I did not know that fact that you just said until right now, which is, I mean, with Barry Weiss leaving the Times and everything that was going on with that too. It's a very interesting time for publications, and especially to have some of the conversations that we should be having. So full disclosure,
yeah, I'll just say, I because I think this will be interesting to you and your listeners. I don't think it's an accident that it's a Jewish publication. That's kind of the last stand for debate. And because in a way, our community has become a bit of a bridge in an unbridgeable America, where you'll still have Shabbat meals, where people are debating, where people pro and anti-Trump are at a Shabbat meal breaking bread together. And we are one of the very few places left like that. I know a few churches in the South that are sort of racially integrated that are still doing that, although they're the ones that I'm familiar with, their rule is they don't discuss it. And you still have Shabbos meals where people are duking it out that I go to regular, I mean, not during COVID, but so in a way, our community is this bridge. And it's such a, I would not have predicted that, but I think it's a really sacred charge at this moment for our nation.
Now that's a very, very beautiful point, and I agree. I think there's something special about the way that we can have that conversation. I do want to challenge you a little bit on one part of that, which is, for me as a rabbi who sees this, I see those conversations able to take place at Shabbat meals where people are more, what's the right word here? Observant in their Judaism, because then their Judaism comes first. But for a lot of people, and in the conservative world and in conservative Judaism and other places, their political affiliation, once that becomes first, then the Judaism gets fallen by the wayside too, with those conversations, and the wedges that happen have driven families apart, which is horrible. But if the main purpose of coming together is Shabbat, then any other conversation can take place.
I'm worried about being too honest in responding to that, but I very much agree.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's I've seen it myself, and it's really hard, and it's hard for me to listen as a rabbi too to my congregants without inserting some of my own judgment. And so when someone says, you know, my kids won't eat at my Shabbat table anymore because of the political discussions or different things like that, part of me is saying, well, that's really horrible, and that's really awful that would take place. And then another part of me is saying, like, if we can all prioritize our Judaism over our political tribalism, then I don't think that would be a problem that we would have as much. Wishful thinking.
I'm with you, Rabbi.
Yeah. Man, we could talk about that forever too. But so let me say something about the forward. So for full disclosure, I love the forward and have been a huge fan of the forward for a long time. And even in my days in grad school, I got the in my mailbox every week. I got the easy peasy Yiddish version that would come in the mailbox to help me work on my Yiddish, which I loved. And I read all of my favorite articles and all the things I used to read that I really loved were all about Jewish practice and religious observance in some ways. I remember there was a really good article about Asher Yetzar that I loved, like back in like all these really interesting things that were more about orthopraxy, like how you're going to live your Jewish life. And it wasn't until I started reading your op-eds that I started looking at the forward also as being like where I was going for my moral look at the different things that were taking place and the different conversations that were taking place, which doesn't necessarily mean that I always agree with what you write and what you're saying, which is part of the conversation too. But I think you're pointing the conversation in a way that is new and refreshing. And most of all, like you said, that the fact that this is a Jewish publication that's doing this and having these honest conversations instead of taking the easy way out and going back to challah recipes and like the easy things that could probably make it where you weren't risking losing, you know, people who are reading and watching. That's really courageous. And I want you to hear that feedback because, like you said, I think you are getting a lot of voices and a lot of things on your own social media account where you're hearing a lot of the louder voices that are saying mean and awful things. But I want you to hear that because I think of what you're doing is beautiful and courageous. And I think that that's what we need.
Thank you, Rabbi. That means so much to me.
Oh, I'm honored. And so I just want to know that out of everything that you're covering right now and all of these things that you're trying to have these conversations and wrestling with, what has felt like the most challenging topics right now? And maybe it's because of the pushback you're getting, but maybe it's also just the wrestling that you're having within yourself.
So those are two different, I have two different answers.
Okay,
so
great.
the one I've gotten the most pushback and then the one that I'm wrestling the most with personally are different. The one I've gotten the most pushback for, it's still completely unfathomable to me, but it's pushing back against anti-Semitism on the left. If you had told me 3 years ago when I started this job that that would be what I got canceled for over and over again, I never would have believed you. Like, in what universe does the left want to be identified with silencing and bullying people for pushing back against anti-Semitism? But that has been where the most vigorous and vicious and horrifying pushback has been. I will say I've gotten like rape threats and death threats from sort of people on the right as well, which obviously you can't compare the two. Like, that is horrible. And, you know, we know that the right is more identified with physical violence and threats and attacks, but I have not had any physical attacks. I've had, you know, I have gotten those threats, but in a way it's much easier to compartmentalize them because they are marginalized socially. Whereas the people who came after me the 3 or 4 times that I stood up and said no to anti-Semitism on the left are major figures in the mainstream, and they tried to ruin my life. And it's still unfathomable to me why that is, like why you would not want to say, no, we're in this together. I mean, I am very, very much on the left. I don't believe prisons should exist. I'm a socialist, essentially. But I am considered a heretic who deserves to be deplatformed and canceled. There are petitions circulated regularly calling for me to be fired because I said to one of the 500 most powerful people in America, please don't say anti-Semitic things. So that's that's where I got the most pushback. That's where my heart was broken the most. When people sort of accuse me from the right of not caring about Israel or being an anti-Semite, it has a lot less power to wound because I know it's not true. And but when people on the left accuse you of being a racist, you know it's not true, but a lot of people then just accept that as true, and that is extremely painful. And we have to learn how to stand up to that. Like I am considered a racist because I told people not to say anti-Semitic things. Like that's not what racism is. And we have to learn how to stand up to that. And it's very difficult, but you know, your Black friends will stand by you. And I'm sure we'll talk about this, but the new woke culture, in my view, is a moral panic, and most people of color are not interested in living in that world. It's an elite, and it's white people and white guilt that's really propelling it forward and giving it the force that it has today. And I think it's very important for Jews to both stand up for racial justice with every fiber of our being, which is what I consider my life to be dedicated to, racial justice here and in Israel. But also to push back against the shrinking of acceptable discourse and the rendering of people who believe in hearing from the other side as heretics, which is what happened to me. There are now witch hunts out for people who believe we have to listen to Republicans, and I'm a witch in that definition. So So that would be the thing that's most pushback. For me, the struggle is very much to insist that we can have both racial diversity and intellectual and ideological diversity, because so many people are insisting that that is not true. So they will say, no, to publish a settler is to dehumanize Palestinians, even if that settler wants them to have civil rights. The fact that they live in a certain place or they embody a certain position. So they will say essentially, you cannot have both racial diversity and racial justice and ideological and intellectual diversity. And I reject that. But it's very hard to, because I mean, if they are right and I am wrong, the stakes are very high. And so I am very deeply involved in conversation with my Palestinian friends and Black friends and Black Jewish friends who challenge me and question me. And we are in this conversation because I am open to the idea that I am wrong, but I have not yet been convinced. And it's so funny because every time the left tries to cancel me, they seem very shocked that they have to do this once again, that I'm back on the scene. And I too am shocked every time that I have not been convinced by them, but I still am not. I still think that I'm right. And because of these conversations that I have, so I would say that that is a struggle that I'm very emotionally right now, questioning myself all the time, questioning my priors, and publishing people on both sides of this debate, of course, but as you could see from my writing, I still feel pretty convinced. In fact, I wasn't always. I had sort of a change of mind on this front.
I think you're touching on such an important question of who actually gets to call the shots about who's in and who's out and who gets to be listened to and who doesn't get to be listened to. And I try to do the idea of dan l'chatzchut and give people the benefit of the doubt, and know that some people are trying to cancel voices and try to make moral stands because they think they're morally correct, right? And they say if we let this person speak, then maybe this person could influence someone in a hateful way or something like that. And I try to hear that conversation. But at the same time, if there's only a very select few of people who have a certain platform and a certain power and privilege to even be able to say who's in and who's out and who we're listening to and who we're not listening to, then does that defeat the purpose already of the idea of actually being able to hear a diversity of opinions?
No, it's a really good point. And so what people will say, what the people who believe in, what's sort of called cancel culture these days, what they'll say is like, you're calling this cancel culture, but it used to be a tiny cohort of white men got to decide who was in and out. And now it's, millions of voices on social media who get to decide. And how is that bad? That's like a democratic development. That's kind of the counter argument. And I respect a lot of people who think that. I still think it's wrong, but I'm you exactly put your finger on the right question, which is who gets to decide. And I think even beyond that, what is the metric they are using? And does that metric confer dignity upon every human being, which is ultimately, the goal as Jews, as humans, as Americans, like the ultimate goal.
So I think for me, part of that is, and there is a big part of me that sees it, especially like on Twitter, or kind of the voice of the masses that gets to cancel someone. And part of me, as someone who also leans towards the socialist, likes that idea. But then again, I also recognize that in that moment, social media especially is one moment at a time, and there's no timeline in history that exists on Twitter. So once someone's canceled, then everyone moves on to someone else, and there's no possibility of even saying, wow, I've learned from something, can we talk about this again? Or it's over, it's done, it's one moment that happens, and it's policing, and then there's no trial, there's no anything else, everything is done just on the spot. It's kind of like vigilante justice in that way.
There's a countercultural pushback against that cancel culture, and they call it a religion, the new wokeness. But I reject that, because as religious people, we know that, one of the cornerstones is tshuva, forgiveness, grace, whatever your religion calls it, is the idea that your intentions matter, and that there's a way back. And you're right, there is no way back here. And I think also people, yes, they talk about it as the masses, but the masses aren't on Twitter, you know, like the masses voted for Joe Biden, right? Like, so it's like that, you know, but you know, Twitter hates Joe Biden. So I think, and when you look at polling from minority communities so definitely from working class communities, but minority communities as well, they're just not as woke as the sort of the Twitterati, which, you know, essentially is a bunch of, you know, overeducated, underemployed, you know, or media characters who have, you know, I have a whole theory about how this has happened, but the idea that this is democratic, I think, or democratization of the masses, I sort of resist that as well. Although, like I said, you know, you will see pieces arguing that in the forward in the near future.
Good enough. Good disclaimer. So I want to get back to this topic too, and go a little bit deeper, but I also just want the viewers and the listeners who aren't as familiar with your work as I am to just kind of see the diversity of topics that you're covering, so they can understand kind of where the sacrificial element is coming from. Because I think just let me read your headlines from the last year and a half, because I think people will start to understand. So going in kind of reverse chronological order here. A new intelligentsia is pushing back against wokeness, which we're going to talk about because I loved it. How our growing consensus against racism turned into a moral panic. You can't reconcile a nation that's never been equal. 3 Black pastors reflect on this moment. De Blasio is stoking anti-Semitism. He's not alone. Thank you, Sheldon Adelson.
A classic.
Right next to it, right? Coronavirus exposed a huge gap. But thank you, Sheldon Adelson. Here are my 2 favorite ones right next to each other. My Bernie Sanders problem and how AIPAC proved Bernie right. Right next to each other. And then this moment where horrible things and the rise in anti-Semitism was taking place after what happened in Pittsburgh and Poway, and then what was going on in New York and New Jersey, why no one can talk about the attacks against Orthodox Jews, which again I could talk to you for an hour about that article alone, but that was one of the times when I was turning to your writing a lot too, to try to figure out what was happening even within the Jewish community. But I think that is a good array of how I can just read some of these titles of your articles and see how the right would be attacking you and how the left would be attacking you. But I also need to say, and I think this is important for even the people that read you on the forward, that you're also writing daily pushes, ethical, moral pushes on your social media and on Twitter for us to live up to the values that we claim to hold. And I mean we in a universal sense, but specifically here in a Jewish sense as Jews. I feel like almost daily you're sharing information and your own thoughts for us to raise our voices about the genocide taking place against the Uyghur Muslims in China, and to challenge us if we really meant when we said never again. And that is particularly powerful to me to see every day. And so I guess my question in not just your articles, but also on what's going on in your Twitter feed and in your social media is how does your Judaism and your relationship with your Judaism inform and direct what you're writing about? How is it your ethical compass? How does it guide what you're wrestling with and challenging us to wrestle with?
You know, as Jews, we were not put on this planet to be angry on social media or to oppose or support Donald Trump or to become famous or to pursue our ambitions. We were put on this planet to pursue human dignity and make sure that every human that we encounter, who we could possibly help, has, you know, the Tzelem Elohim that God gave them, that is recognized by others, you know, the pursuit of human dignity, which takes, I think in our moment, the form often of racial justice, but also economic justice, which is something I've evolved on very, very, very much. And so I would say from that point of view, I feel very motivated by that and very connected to the Jewish texts on those questions. But also, I think this question of like what used to be like bipartisanship, now it's called often like both sidesism, hearing the other side of the case. Like that, I know too many Jews on the other side who I know are good people. And it's never been a choice for me to call them fascists or Nazis. I know how they think, and I know why they're making the decisions they're making, and they're making them out of the pursuit of human dignity. Maybe not for the same people that liberal Jews are, hoping to confer dignity on. And I think it's just, it was never really a choice. Like I would love to say like I chose this, but you can't when your rabbi is someone who is on the other side of every major question, and he is the person you look up to and ask for advice, because there's no one who has a soul like that who you can trust on ethical issues. It's very hard to, and it's not that I don't see the problems with, I'm as disgusted as everybody else with the things that would disgust a liberal lefty person. But it's about, I guess it's not about the president himself, but it's about how I see the others who maybe have made other decisions about how to think about politics, and even Israel, like as a lefty on Israel who has a lot of relationships in the Palestinian community, like, to then go home, even to my own family and hear things that I know would horrify them. You don't get to opt out of that, I feel like, as a Jew. And there has to be something that comes before me. Like there has to be something beyond like the sense I can make of something in a given moment. I think it's exactly what you were saying. Like we have to put the Shabbos first, like, there's that saying, like more than the Jews kept the Shabbos, Shabbos kept the Jews. Like you have to put something above your own mind, because first of all, like we know that our all the research, confirmation bias, whatever, our minds are not reliable. But I think it's just depressing, like for there to be nothing else like beyond like everything else. Like if I can only, like the idea of relying on oneself completely, like that just seems to me like it's morally bankrupt, it's problematic on many issues, but it's also just like depressing as all get out. Like that like I'm the only thing I have to rely on. And with our history as Jews, like just this like amazing tradition, these books that are just like like every time you open them, you're just so humbled by what a person can achieve when they're not relying on themselves. They think there's something beyond a standard that they have to live by that just goes beyond their own narishkeit. Like I feel really lucky. Like every Shabbos when I get to the Kiddush and I say Asher Bachar Banu Mikol Ha'amim, I tear up every week because I feel really blessed to have been given this. And of course, there are times when you feel further from the divine and closer to the divine. And but the idea that, I'm rambling here, but the idea that we've been given this gift that is a huge responsibility, but a magnificent one. And I feel that very strongly. I can't even remember what you asked me.
No, and yet you answered it so beautifully and perfectly. No, I asked you about how your Judaism directs as a compass for the way that you write and the things that you respond to. And I think you went into a kind of a philosophical, theological place, but I think that's good. And I think that's great. Because I think you're right. I think I don't think this is true for everyone, but I think for people like you and me, and I think for the majority of Jews, we are moved the most by the people who write, and the things that they're writing is not about them, right? Yeah. That it's motivated and inspired by something bigger. And even with the activists that we love the most, they're not focused on themselves. The people like Martin Luther King Jr. had such a beautiful way of connecting to people, because it wasn't about me. It was about grace and about peace and about something much bigger. It was about the promised land. It was very religious in that sense.
Totally.
Which,
Totally.
and I think you're right with our tradition of being people of the book. When we can open a book and see, we'd be so deeply humbled by the fact that if we could get a taste of what some of these great authors of ours have felt with their lives being motivated and directed by an idea of kedusha and of holiness and of trying to achieve something sacred and just, right? That word is important in our religion, very, very deeply so. That those things should bring us to tears. And I agree, for me, those words that every day bring me to tears is the idea of matir asurim, of releasing the bound, because I think that means more than just captives. I think that means it means releasing ourselves from our egos and recognizing that who we are is about our family, and our family is, the Jewish people, but also about people in general, and how freeing it can be to recognize that it's not about us. I feel like for a lot of people, when we're driven by our egos, that's a terrifying thought, to think that something's not about us. But to come to the idea of how freeing it can be when we actually think about our world being directed towards other people and the pursuit of something bigger.
That's really beautiful.
Those aren't my words. That's just Judaism's words. So
Judaism.
Judaism. L'chaim, l'chaim.
No, I do. I think of myself very much as a hostage negotiator. Like I see myself as because people, I think, are held hostages by their fears, although by their egos as well. And I certainly struggle with that a lot. But so that really resonates with me.
So this was going to be the next question I was going to ask you, but I think it's kind of related to that. And I'm gonna cite your last article, because I think this is very much involved with that. So your last piece, which is called "The New Intelligentsia is Pushing Back Against Wokeness." So first of all, I have to thank you for introducing me to the fifth column, which wasn't just from this article, but I think like a month ago you put it in something on Twitter, and I started listening to them. And right when I started listening, I was really angry. And then I realized where they were coming from. And then I was like, wow, these people are actually really, really smart and really bright. So
not
first of all, thank you. Not at all.
Yeah.
But like, without knowing any of their own background, like at first I was just like, wow, these guys don't get it at all. And then when they started talking, I'm like, wow, these guys really get it.
I think the first one I listened to was these 5 Black intellectuals. Well, 2 of them don't identify as Black, but they will say that they have African descent. So that's why I didn't say Black in the headline, but these 5 intellectuals who are pushing back against wokeness. And it was just such a breath of fresh air. Like just these, they're all so brilliant and just and disagree about so many things, but to hear that cacophony of their voices saying this is dehumanizing, it was incredible.
Right. So everyone has to read the article and then listen to the podcast too, because I think they're really good. They could listen, their pods are a little too long for my liking, but they're good. They're good. But I want to ask you about the response, because I think it's really interesting. And so tell me if I'm getting the thesis wrong at all here, but I think if I read this right, the idea is that the pushback is based on the idea that wokeness isn't actually so woke, right? It's the emphasis on race and on identity, especially Blackness, makes categorical assumptions and paints people with a broad brush rather than focusing on individuals and their own personal story. Is that right? Is that kind of the idea?
Yeah, definitely. It's so wokeness is kind of shorthand for this new movement that's known as AntiRacism, which is brilliant marketing, because of course we're all anti-racist, right? The Black Lives Matter movement right now in America has 75% support, meaning the vast majority of Republicans at this point also are anti-racist.
Right.
But anti-racism is this view promulgated by Robin DiAngelo in her book White Fragility, and Ibrahim X. Kendi in his book How to Be an Anti-Racist. And it's this idea that race, they both admit that race is a social construct, but they insist that every interaction be in the service of sort of decentering whiteness is what they call it, and kind of elevating minorities in order to counteract racism. And so what it essentially ends up doing is essentializing race, or essentializing every interaction and turning it into a racialized one. And the pushback from these intellectuals is that that is dehumanizing, that to insist that we as white people, white Jews, and they as Black people be reduced to a racial interaction first and foremost, even if other things can then happen, that is dehumanizing, that to create this sort of immutable category, inescapable category, that takes away their ability to function as full individuals on this planet, and that it exaggerates as well the level of harm that they are dealing with. That's another thing that came up with a lot. So I interviewed 4 of them, and it came up a lot, this idea that they don't feel that their lives are depressing, and that it's insulting, like the way that they are, and this came up a lot. So I was the person who had first called out Congresswoman Ilhan Omar's comments all about the Benjamins as being anti-Semitic. And the pushback I got was that it was racist to criticize her because she was Black and Muslim. And that is dehumanizing. The idea that that one of the 435 people who decides whether we go to war or not is somehow too weak to withstand some piddly Jewish opinion editor saying, please don't speak about Jews that way.
Right.
It's insulting, it is. And that's not to deny police brutality that affects African-American men more than anybody else. It's not to deny redlining and the legacy of slavery and the daily civil rights abuses that Black people suffer from at the hands of the government. I mean, it is to say that we have made huge progress on the racial front is not to deny the remaining problems that I am completely 100% devoted to ending, you know, mass incarceration, things like this, the Black-white wealth gap. These are huge, devastating problems, a stain on our nation that I'm happy to report the vast majority of Americans are now disgusted by and want to see fixed. And to ignore that progress is not, it's counterproductive, and it's insulting to a lot. So these, I interviewed these 4 intellectuals who were part of a cohort of 7 or 8, and they disagree on everything except this. You know, some are more lefty economically, some are more libertarian, but they know that their views much more closely track with the vast majority of African Americans and Latinos in America, who are just not as woke as liberal whites who have abandoned essentially religion in favor of this. So yeah, that's the argument.
Yeah, so that's interesting, because then it's, you know, I'm just thinking out loud already, but then the very idea of us coming and having this like this great moment in this country of confronting our racist past and all of these things, which, you know, again, the good woke leftists say, you know, about time, this is what we need to do, and these are the conversations we need to be having. And when you're talking to someone, you need to be very aware and cognizant of their race, their background. Here are the words you can say, here are the words you can't say, here are the things here, you know, again, it's people making some decisions about what's okay and what's not okay. But built into that already is the idea that that conversation is already taking place for a woke white community to be able to have the conversation, instead of the entirety of our population saying, well, hold on, can I interject and say what's not okay about that, right? And I wrestle with that a little bit, because part of it is, I don't know if I trust even with the polls of 75%, I don't know if I trust us enough to know that we can all just admit that racism is bad and we need to be doing everything in our power not to, and not to propagate or not to encourage any kind of racist forms at all, because I see those numbers, and then I also see people in very powerful positions of leadership say that racism doesn't exist or systemic racism doesn't exist, and then, you know, that number feels bad again already to me. So I guess part of the idea of this response to wokeness, or the anti-wokeness or whatever it might be, is it feels kind of idealistic in some way, where of course we should be able to see past the general categorization and go straight to individual lives and narratives and stories. But I guess so my question is, but do we still need a moment of reckoning first to understand peoplehood in general? Because I don't think that white America understands peoplehood in the same way. Or is it dangerous to even have that moment of reckoning because it can also be dehumanizing in that same way?
It's a really good question. I would say that I think one of the failures of America and of the left in America is the loss of the collective. We are very individualistic, and the media especially is less religious than America more generally. And you see that in the coverage, in the contempt they have for religious people, for the Christian right, and for Orthodox Jews. And that's it's bad for us. It's bad for the health of our nation. I don't know if I'm sure you've read Bowling Alone by Robert Putnam, which made me start going to shul much more regularly again, just as a patriot, what's lost when we stop showing up. So I definitely think we need to embrace a sense of the collective. And I think the left needs to be reclaiming patriotism and a love of America, which despite all of its huge sins and problems is a great, wonderful nation, and one we all choose to live in, even though we have the option of living somewhere else. So we understand that it's better than that place, right? We've all made that choice. I would say that a collective based on race reminds me very much of things that, the worst parts of our history. And I'm not a hypocrite about it. I think it's weird when Jews are proud of Einstein, because the thing they're proud of is a racial connection to him. And I think that's gross.
Right.
We got the books, we don't need the Einstein, we've got the peoplehood, but our peoplehood has porous borders, and we allow people to join and to leave. And we have people of all races in our community. And so I from a Jewish point of view, I do also reject that kind of a collective based on race. I would say that it's not really my place to tell Black people how to identify, but my sense is that they too, that the majority, they don't want you to be sitting there, thinking about this constantly. There is something, I think, dehumanizing for us, to me. I mean, I know from personal relationships, and I think I just don't buy it that this kind of symbolic Twitter obsession with what's in the white person's brain is the thing that's going to end mass incarceration.
Right.
I mean, President Trump did more to end mass incarceration than President Obama did, right? He has freed at this point 3,000 Black men, more or less, from prison with the First Step Act. Who knows why he did it? Probably gross reasons, like Kim Kardashian asked Jared Kushner. But he did it, and I think we have had the moment of reckoning. And after George Floyd, you had Lindsey Graham and Mitch McConnell talking about police brutality against African American men. I never thought I would live to see that, and we're in the midst of the reckoning, but it's not going to happen. I think about, okay, why are they saying defund the police? Something that Black people are less likely to answer. A recent Gallup poll from yesterday are less likely to want that than white Americans by a big margin, by about 10%. Why defund? Why not reform the police? Well, because everybody wants to reform the police. You don't get a culture war if you say something that everybody wants. Everyone understands there's a huge problem with police brutality. We're there, but instead of sort of embracing that, we have to turn it into and I don't totally blame the left for that. It's the breakdown is when you're negotiating with people who are not negotiating in good faith, and that's on both sides. There's just a crisis of good faith, and again, I that's sort of where the Jews come in. We don't really, that's a luxury we can't afford. We don't get to shouldn't. I mean, of course, sometimes we do, as you mentioned. With the gap between Orthodox and liberal Jews is it breaks my heart sometimes, but. Negotiating in good faith is what we have to represent at this time.
Yeah. And it's complicated, right? It's complex as Jews.
Yeah.
Because I'm thinking a lot about what you just said, and part of this idea, right, is a little bit paradoxical, which I think is also just a central idea of Judaism. Should be a paradox all the time, right? Is that we're stuck in this complexity in a really challenging way as Jews, right? Because even the broad brush strokes, even if the broad brush strokes don't apply, or they shouldn't apply, right? And so we have no choice but to focus on the micro. But we also, as Jews, fail to do that all the time, right? And instead we focus on a normalized idea of what Judaism is. Right? Judaism is whatever it might be. And in America, that usually means white and Ashkenazi. And how do we hold on to that ethnoculturalism, right? Where we care about the Jewish people while also acknowledging that Judaism is so beautiful because of the myriad identities that fall into what Judaism is.
So that's more, I think, a question I should be asking you than you asking me.
Please don't ask me.
I will say that we're lucky because we have the books. Like we're not alone, and we're not at sea. We're tied to something miraculous that already happened, that our ancestors somehow managed to bequeath to us. So in a way, we're just not alone in this. We have, 2,000 years of other Jews struggling with these same questions. And as long as we cleave to those books and, you put the Shabbos first, like you said, this is the exact question we should be asking. I think it's a great question.
So my last question for you, but before I kind of give it over to you to kind of share your last words is do we fight anti-Semitism in that same way then? Is that a tool that we're not using so much, which is that instead of saying, no, you're propagating an old stereotype, or this is hurtful to me as a Jewish person, and let me tell you why, but instead say, wow, you really are showing a huge, huge lack of information about the Jewish people because of, look at thousands of years of Judaism and all the diversity and all the beauty that falls in the micro of who we are. I feel like we don't use that enough. We usually just say, no, that's offensive. Hitler used it. That was in Der Stürmer. Let me tell you why that is bad. Instead of saying, how could you possibly be thinking about this when look at all the different colors of Jews that we have. Look at all of the different, like you said before, the ideas of economic justice, that we're covering the full spectrum where there's wealthy Jews and there's poor Jews. And we're, trying to figure out this, how to have this microcosm of Judaism and say, it's just to even try to qualify us as one broad group of people is going to be a fool's errand.
Oh, that's a really good question. I was once at a conference about 6 months ago, and there was a little 8-year-old girl in the front. And in the Q&A, she raised her hand and she said, "What should I tell people when they ask me why everyone hates the Jews?" And I said, you should tell them, you tell me. Why do you hate us? Like, never take the responsibility for answering that question. It's not on you. Like, we didn't do anything to deserve it. I think this is not going to answer your question. I don't have a good answer to your question, but I'll just say we're living in a really interesting moment where on the one hand, thank God, we have a lot of power. We have the 17th most powerful army on the planet in case things go really south. And then we have a lot of friends. We're very beloved in America. About 70% of Americans say that Jews are their favorite minority, and we tend to use that capital often to help other minorities and to stand by them, which is wonderful and gives me a lot of pride. We are less good at standing by our most vulnerable, the Jews of the Jews, as I call them, the Orthodox, because, for some reason, I used to be much more upset about, I think that liberal Jews feel very rejected by the Orthodox. They feel, I can't imagine being a Reform rabbi woman and knowing they don't even recognize that I'm ordained and I'm supposed to stand up for them. And in fact, people have said that to me on Twitter. And I used to think like their heads are being bashed in every day in the streets of New York, and you're worried about, but I really hear that. I mean, it is really challenging. And I think, we all need to do more on this front. So I would say, in terms of anti-Semitism, you know, it comes in so many different forms these days. And the question, you know, like I think, for example, when I think of what happened with Nick Cannon, where at first he didn't apologize and he lost one of his jobs. And then he did this really heartfelt apology and he, you know, started reading and educating himself, and then he didn't lose the second job. And I was like, oh yeah, that's how it should go. Like, you know, you apologize, you educate yourself, and everybody kind of, you know, wishes you well and helps you along. I don't have a good answer to your question, but I would say, like, I would like to see Jews standing up for each other more. And we do seem to sort of feel a bit embarrassed by the question of solidarity with other Jews right now, whether it's Israel because, you know, Israelis behave badly, or it's the Orthodox because they behave badly. And it's very easy for us to understand when it comes to others that, like, their behavior should not determine, you know, civil rights are not, we know this about Palestinians, they're not a reward for behaving well, for behaving like white people or behaving the way white people want you to. They are a condition for existence. And I guess that would be my wish on that question.
No, I had a congregant say something very, very wise to me once, which was, I think I had made a post on Facebook or even maybe said something from the Bima, criticizing someone who was Jewish and in a position of leadership and probably in, you know, a chief rabbi or something. And he came up to me after services and said, you know, it had to have been on Facebook or Twitter or something. And he came up to me after services and he said, it's okay for us to fight and it's okay for us to be upset with someone. And you're right. You were completely right. They behaved really inappropriately, but not everyone also needs to know the baggage between our own family members too. Not everyone needs to see what's going on with the feuds that we have within ourselves as well. And sometimes some of these best conflicts are best hashed out between us.
So as a journalist, that's a really big question, right? Like, when do you keep it in the family and when do you air the dirty laundry? And it's a really tough question. So we ran a piece about a year ago. There was this was a very interesting story. So a teacher who had taught at 6 different day schools, modern Orthodox day schools, he wrote an op-ed and he said, I want to run this op-ed. They are teaching dual loyalties. I've been in 6 schools and it bothers me, like the way they talk about Israel. So we thought about this a lot, like, do we run this? Like, on the one hand, it will be playing into the hands of the anti-Semites. On the other hand, it's coming from within the community. And it's so funny because we ran the piece and people got very, very, very angry. And they assumed that he was a left-winger and that he was saying this from a position of not liking Israel, when the truth is he was very, very religious. He was really Orthodox, and he was very bothered that like, one of the complaints was that his Torah class would get canceled for some assembly about something that happened in Israel. You know, like, he's like, right, yeah. What are we teaching them anyway? But that was a real question. Like, on the one hand, it seemed like it belonged in the public sphere in the Jewish community. It was a conversation we should have. On the other hand, you know, people felt that this was stoking anti-Semitism, and it was like one of those real ethical, really gets you in the kishkas.
That's fascinating. Wow. Yeah. I can totally understand that, because the question is, it would just show a profound misunderstanding of the question, right? I mean, if the question is, our kids are spending too much time reading Herzl and Pinsker and not enough reading Gemara, studying Gemara, that's different than an idea of, like, hold on, Israel's bad, we don't want dual loyalty, right?
Right. And I wish I had made that clearer in the editing, because I think that would have helped a lot of people. But maybe not. Maybe it wouldn't have helped at all.
So what I usually like to do to end these conversations is just let my guests say whatever is on their mind. If there's certain things that we should be reading, if there's certain things that you would encourage us to be tackling or kind of wrestling with, or just whatever your thoughts are. The last little bit is yours.
So first of all, I want to say thank you so much. Your congregation is so lucky to have you. I hope they know that. This has been really a wonderful, thoughtful conversation, and I'm truly grateful to the care that you brought to my work. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
My honor.
I guess I would say it's very hard not to let others define us, especially in sort of reverse formation. So what polls show now is that people don't define themselves so much as Democrat or Republican, but they define themselves against the other side, which is a huge temptation, especially when people are attacking you. And I would say it's really important to sort of have a deep sense of who you are and what you believe that's rooted in Jewish tradition for us, because it's so rich. And so that I think is really important. That's something that I struggle with, and I think is, in terms of having debates and conversations and keeping that channel open to the other side, that's really a big challenge, is to know who you are and have confidence in your values. And the way you get that is by willing to change your mind. And I also think it's really important to remember it's not a mitzvah to sort of yell at somebody on social media, but it is one of the most important mitzvahs to treat every human with dignity and bring that human dignity to every interaction. And that's really hard to remember, because the things we fight about on social media are really important. You know, they're really big issues, like, you know, racial justice, for example, is the most important issue. And so feeling like you're in a debate about that, about human dignity, you know, is really, it's a big deal. But I would say, you know, as Jews, like, we know what our mission is, and it's really important to stick with that. And I feel like with this rabbi, you're probably already ahead of the game. So thank you so much, Rabbi.
Thank you. Really, really, and I'll send the check in the mail for you saying those kind words at the end. No, but thank you. I really can't thank you enough for taking time out of your day to chat with me. And I'm going to continue reading you and making sure that people in the congregation can read your wonderful words and thoughts too. Because you're, again, let me just say that, forget the haters. I mean, the haters are good too. The haters also push us to do some good soul searching and different things.
Yeah.
Right. But just know that I think you're doing amazing work, and I think you're making us have the conversations that we should be having. So thank you for everything you do, and thank you for taking the time.
Thank you so much. All the best.
You too.